Howdy, y'all. Come on in and rest up. I just got the fire going, so stay a while and let me tell y'all a story to help you fall asleep. Now, I know you're here to wind down and relax, so why don't y'all tell me what helps you relax in the comments below. Now, don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear more stories. So let's get to it. It was back in 82, maybe 83. Lord, time flies like gnats on a summer evening. I was still a young feller then, full of vinegar and the need to prove myself. My daddy, bless his soul, had taught me everything he knew about fishing the Gulf, but I was restless, always looking for something bigger, something legendary. The whispers started in the docks down in Biloxi. Fishermen talk, you know, always exaggerating, always trying to outdo each other. But this was different. This wasn't just tavern talk. This was hushed tones and nervous eyes. Talk of a monster grouper. They called him Old Leviathan. Now I'd caught my share of big grouper over the years. 100-pounders, maybe even a touch more. But this was different. They said Old Leviathan was different. They said he lived out past the continental shelf, in a spot where the water was dark as ink, and the pressure could crush a submarine. They said he was bigger than a Volkswagen, with eyes like dinner plates, and a mouth that could swallow a man whole. Most folks dismissed it as fisherman's lore, a tall tale spun to scare the tourists. But something about the way they talked about him, the fear in their voices, it stuck with me. It got under my skin like chiggers in July. I couldn't shake it, so I started doing my research. I pored over charts, studied the currents, talked to divers who'd gone out that far. Most just laughed in my face, told me I was chasing a ghost. But a few, the ones I trusted, they admitted they'd heard the rumors too. They'd seen things out there, strange readings on their sonar, unexplained shadows in the deep. I had a boat back then, a 28-foot Bertram, named her the Wanderer. She was a sturdy girl, built for the open water. I spent weeks getting her ready, reinforced the hull, upgraded the sonar, rigged up a heavy-duty winch that could haul a small car out of the ocean, and I started preparing my tackle. Now, you gotta understand, regular grouper fishing gear ain't gonna cut it with something like Old Leviathan. I'm talking about thick braided line, strong enough to tow a truck, hooks forged from hardened steel, and a rod that felt like holding a telephone pole. I even had a custom-made lure built, a giant articulated sardine, painted with luminescent paint to attract attention in the deep. My wife, bless her heart, thought I was losing my mind. She'd say, "Jerry, you're going to get yourself killed chasing that fish. Leave it alone. It's just a story." But I couldn't. The idea of Old Leviathan had burrowed its way into my soul. I had to know if he was real. Finally, the day came. The weather was perfect. Calm seas, clear skies, and a gentle breeze blowing off the Gulf. I packed the Wanderer with enough fuel, food, and water to last a week. I kissed my wife goodbye, told her I loved her, and pointed the Wanderer's bow towards the horizon. The first few hours were uneventful. The sun beat down, the engine hummed, and the water stretched out in every direction, an endless expanse of blue. As I got further from shore, the other boats disappeared. It was just me, the Wanderer, and the open ocean. Then I hit the spot. The coordinates I'd painstakingly calculated from the charts and the divers' reports. The bottom dropped off sharply, plunging into what felt like another world. The water turned a deep, forbidding blue, almost black. The sonar screen lit up with jagged peaks and valleys, indicating a complex underwater landscape. I cut the engine and let the Wanderer drift. The silence was deafening. All I could hear was the creak of the hull and the distant cries of gulls. I took a deep breath, said a little prayer, and lowered my line. The weight of the lure and the sinker pulled the line taut. It felt like I was lowering a small anchor. I watched the line spool out, counting the meters as they ticked off on the counter. 50 meters, 100 meters, 200 meters. The water was getting colder, darker. Finally, at 300 meters, the line stopped. I was on the bottom. I engaged the reel and started jigging the lure, trying to attract some attention. I waited. Nothing. Just the feel of the current tugging at the line. I waited another hour. Still nothing. Doubt started to creep into my mind. Maybe my wife was right. Maybe this was all a fool's errand. Maybe old Leviathan was just a myth, but I couldn't give up. Not yet. I adjusted my position slightly and tried again. This time I let the lure sit on the bottom for a longer period, hoping to pique the interest of anything that might be lurking nearby. Then it happened. The rod bent double. It was like hitting a brick wall. The line screamed off the reel. I grabbed the rod with both hands, braced my feet against the deck, and held on for dear life. Whatever was on the other end was powerful, incredibly powerful. It was pulling the Wanderer sideways, like she was nothing more than a toy boat. I tightened the drag on the reel, but it didn't seem to make a difference. The line kept screaming out. My arms were aching, my back was burning, and my knuckles were white. I knew that if this thing kept running at this pace, I was going to get spooled, and once that line snapped, whatever was down there would be gone forever. I had to do something. Slowly, carefully, I started to gain some ground. Inch by inch, I cranked the reel, fighting against the immense weight and power on the other end. My muscles screamed in protest, but I refused to give in. For what felt like an eternity, it was a battle of wills. Me against this thing. The sun started to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red. The air grew cooler, and the sea became even darker. Finally, after what felt like hours, I started to see some progress. The runs became shorter, the pulls less violent. I was gaining line. I knew I was getting close. Then I saw it. On the sonar screen, a massive shape appeared. It was bigger than anything I'd ever seen. It dwarfed the Wanderer. It was old Leviathan. My heart pounded in my chest. I was terrified, but I was also exhilarated. I had found him. The legend was real. Slowly, painstakingly, I brought him closer to the surface. The strain on the line was incredible. I could feel the heat of the reel burning against my fingers. Then he broke the surface. The sight of him took my breath away. He was enormous. His body was a mottled brown and gray, covered in barnacles and scars. His eyes were huge, like ancient knowing orbs. His mouth was a cavernous maw, lined with rows of razor-sharp teeth. He looked at me, or at least I thought he did. It was hard to tell in the fading light, but I felt a connection, a sense of awe and respect. This was an ancient creature, a survivor. He had seen things I couldn't even imagine. For a moment, we were locked in a silent standoff, me and old Leviathan. Then he did something unexpected. He just stopped fighting. He hung there, suspended in the water, his massive body barely moving. I loosened the drag on the reel and let him rest. I knew that I could probably reel him in, get him close enough to the boat to take a picture, maybe even try to tag him. But something told me not to. I looked at him, at his ancient eyes, at his scarred body. I realized that I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need to conquer him. I just needed to know that he was real. So I did the only thing that felt right. I cut the line. The lure, the hook, the leader, all drifted away, sinking back into the depths. Old Leviathan turned slowly and disappeared back into the darkness. I sat there for a long time after that, staring at the empty ocean. The sun had set completely, and the stars had started to come out. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the waves against the hull of the Wanderer. I felt a profound sense of peace. I had found what I was looking for, not in the fish itself, but in the journey, in the challenge, in the knowledge that there are still mysteries out there, hidden in the depths of the ocean. I started the engine and turned the Wanderer towards home. The journey back was long and uneventful, but I wasn't the same man who had left. I had seen old Leviathan, and I had learned something about myself in the process. I never told anyone the full story. Most folks wouldn't have believed me anyway. They would have said I was crazy or lying or just plain old making it up. But that's all right. The memory is enough. It's a story that only I know the full truth of. The Wanderer's hull had some damage over the years and ended up being sold for scraps, but it all paid off. That fishing adventure gave me a lifetime worth of stories to tell. I tell you, this next tale's been sitting with me for years, and every time I think on it, I swear it gets better. Let's get to it. The bayou. Now that's a place where the water runs deep, and the stories run even deeper. I remember this one particular time, a trip that started out like any other, but turned into something I'll never forget. The kind of memory that sticks with a man, shaping the way he sees the water and the things that live in it. It was early fall, the air thick and humming with the sound of cicadas, the kind of morning where the mist lingers on the water like a ghost reluctant to leave. I had set out before first light, my boat cutting through the stillness of the bayou, the only sound the steady chug of the motor and the occasional splash of something unseen slipping into the water. I had fished these waters for years, knew the turns of the channels like the lines on my own hands, but no matter how many times I came out here, the bayou always held a kind of mystery that kept a man on his toes. I had a feeling about that day, the kind of quiet sense that the water was ready to give something up if I was patient enough to take it. I found my spot, a little opening where the cypress trees leaned in close, their knotted roots stretching into the murky depths. Spanish moss draped down like nature's own curtains, shading the water from the climbing sun. I cut the engine, letting the boat drift, the silence wrapping around me like an old coat. I started out slow, casting my line, watching the bait disappear into the dark water. The bayou wasn't like the open sea. Out here everything was slower, quieter, but no less dangerous. You learned to respect the things beneath the surface, things that had been here long before you and would be here long after. Gators watched from the banks, their eyes barely breaking the surface, patient as time itself. Snakes coiled in the trees, waiting for an unsuspecting meal to pass beneath them. And then there were the fish, big, strong, and mean, the kind that didn't come easy. That morning, it didn't take long before I felt the first tug. A sharp jerk, then a second, stronger than the first. I knew right away this was no ordinary fish. The pull had weight, the kind that spoke of something old and stubborn. I set the hook, bracing myself as the fight began. The line cut through the water, sending ripples out in every direction. My reel whined as the fish took off, dragging me into a battle that I hadn't quite been prepared for. Minutes passed, maybe more, the world shrinking down to just me, the rod, and whatever was on the other end of that line. I fought with everything I had, muscles straining, sweat beading on my forehead despite the coolness of the morning. The fish wasn't giving up, but neither was I. I could feel the strength in its movements, the determination. I respected it, even as I pulled against it, knowing that out here, every fight was a test. And then, just when I thought I had the upper hand, the fish changed tactics. It dove hard, pulling the line straight down, the kind of move that made my stomach drop. I held on, digging my feet into the bottom of the boat, my arms burning with the effort. I wasn't sure how much longer I could last, but I wasn't about to let this one get away. Finally, after what felt like forever, I saw it. A massive shadow rising from the depths, breaking through the murky water with a force that took my breath away. A gar, and not just any gar. This was the biggest I had ever seen. Its body was long and armored, prehistoric in its design, its sharp teeth glistening in the weak morning light. It thrashed, trying one last time to break free, but I was ready. With one final pull, I brought it alongside the boat, staring into the wild, unblinking eyes of a creature that had probably been alive longer than I had. I took a moment to catch my breath, feeling the weight of the catch in my hands, the way its body pulsed with life and defiance. This wasn't just another fish. It was a reminder of why I did this, why I came out here time and time again, chasing something just beyond my reach. I let out a slow breath, knowing that this was a story I'd carry with me for the rest of my days. As I made my way back, the bayou stretched out ahead of me, just as mysterious and untamed as ever. The mist had lifted, the sun rising higher, casting long shadows across the water. I had won my fight that day, but I knew the bayou would always have more waiting for me. And as long as I had breath in my lungs and strength in my arms, I'd keep coming back, answering the call of the water. I was just sitting here, remembering another time out on the water, and I figured, why keep it to myself? Let me tell you all about it. See, I've always been drawn to the legend of Old Man Tiber. Now, I'm not talking about a person. Old Man Tiber was the name local folk gave to this massive mythical catfish that supposedly lived in the darkest depths of the Mississippi River, way down south near the Louisiana border. Folks said he was bigger than a rowboat, with whiskers like mooring ropes and a temper to match. Most dismissed it as just a tall tale, something to scare kids away from the river's edge. But I always held a healthy dose of respect and a sliver of belief for the old legends. Back then I was younger, stronger, and a whole heap braver or maybe dumber, depending on how you look at it. I had this little 16-foot aluminum boat, the Salty Siren, I called her. She wasn't much to look at, but she was reliable, and she knew the river like the back of my hand. Me and that boat, we were partners. So the summer of '92 was especially hot and dry. The river was low, and the fish were sluggish. I was catching enough to keep my head above water, but nothing spectacular. But something was different that year. The old-timers, the ones who'd been fishing the Mississippi their whole lives, they were all talking about strange currents, unusually large disturbances in the water, and missing nets, sturdy, industrial-strength nets, ripped to shreds like confetti. Of course, the whisper of Old Man Tiber grew louder. Some claimed to have seen him, a fleeting glimpse of a dark, monstrous shape beneath the murky surface. I told myself it was just the heat playing tricks on their minds, but the seed of curiosity, that little fishing bug, had been planted. I decided I wanted to research. I took out my old maps, the ones my granddaddy used to have. They were filled with notes and marked locations of prime fishing spots. I scoured them, and the details that were drawn up matched all the old legends and sightings of Old Man Tiber, and discovered it all centered around a particularly deep bend in the river, known as the Devil's Elbow. The current there was treacherous, swirling around submerged trees and rock formations, creating a natural whirlpool. It had always been a dangerous spot, avoided by most fishermen. Of course, I was not most fishermen. For weeks I researched and read, and asked all the local fishermen and historians about the legends of Old Man Tiber. I spent days studying the currents and mapping the underwater terrain with my old depth finder. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that there was something extraordinary lurking in those depths. Now, I'm not usually one for fancy equipment. I'm more of a hook, line, and sinker kind of guy. But if I was going after something legendary, I knew I needed to up my game. So I went down to Cletus's Bait and Tackle, the only decent shop for miles, and I told him my plan. Cletus, he was a grizzled old cuss with a walleye-shaped birthmark on his cheek and a permanent smell of catfish stingbait clinging to him. He listened to my story with a skeptical glint in his eye. Old Man Tiber, huh? You gone loco, Jerry? That's just a myth, a story to scare greenhorns. Maybe, I said, but I'm going to find out for myself. Cletus chuckled, a dry, raspy sound, like sandpaper rubbing against wood. Well, if you're dead set on it, I reckon I can help you out. But don't come crying to me when that monster rips your arms off. He sold me the heaviest duty rod and reel he had, the kind used for deep-sea fishing. The line was braided steel, thick enough to tow a car. He even threw in a special, extra-large hook, one he swore was big enough to snag a small whale. For bait, I did some research. Some say that the old river monsters like the taste of bullhead catfish, and some say they like bluegill. I rigged my line up with a huge live bluegill, hooked right through the back, and added a massive weight to get it down to the bottom. The next morning, before the sun even thought about peeking over the horizon, I loaded up the salty siren and headed towards the Devil's Elbow. The air was thick with humidity, and the mist hung low over the water, giving the river an eerie, almost primordial feel. As I approached the bend, I could feel the current tugging at the boat, a constant reminder of the power lurking beneath the surface. I found a relatively calm spot just outside the main whirlpool anchored the boat as securely as I could, and dropped my line. The weight pulled the bait down quickly, disappearing into the murky depths. Then I waited. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, baking the boat. Sweat dripped off my brow, stinging my eyes. I swigged sweet tea and battled mosquitoes, wondering if I was wasting my time. Maybe Cletus was right. Maybe Old Man Tiber was just a myth. Just as I was about to reel in my line and call it a day, something happened. The rod tip twitched, just a subtle movement, almost imperceptible. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. Then it happened again, a more pronounced tug. "It's on," I muttered, my voice trembling with excitement and a healthy dose of fear. I grabbed the rod, bracing myself. The line went taut, singing a high-pitched whine as something huge started pulling. This wasn't like any fish I'd ever caught before. It wasn't the sharp, erratic jerks of a bass or the steady pull of a gar. This was a slow, deliberate, unstoppable force. The boat lurched violently, nearly throwing me overboard. I gripped the sides, fighting to maintain my balance. The reel screamed as line peeled off at an alarming rate. I tightened the drag, but it barely slowed the beast down. "All right, you prehistoric son of a gun," I grunted, my muscles straining with the effort. "Let's see what you're made of." The battle was on. For what felt like an eternity, I fought that creature. It would pull, I would reel. It would dive, I would resist. My arms ached, my back screamed, but I refused to give up. This wasn't just about catching a fish anymore. This was about proving something to myself, about confronting the legend, about staring into the face of the unknown. The current was working against me, trying to drag the boat into the whirlpool. I fought to keep it pointed upstream, using the motor to compensate for the relentless pull. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the little boat into an oven. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, I began to gain ground. The line tightened, the reel clattered, and I could feel the creature tiring. It wasn't giving up, but its movements were becoming less powerful, less deliberate. After what seemed like an eternity, I finally started to see something. A dark shape began to emerge from the depths, growing larger and larger as it neared the surface. My heart leaped into my throat. It was immense. I'm talking about a fish that dwarfed my boat. Its body was long and thick, covered in leathery, mottled brown skin. Its head was massive, with beady, ancient-looking eyes and a cavernous mouth that could swallow a basketball whole. And those whiskers. They were indeed like mooring ropes, thick and bristly, trailing in the water like seaweed. Old Man Tiber. He was real. I stared at him in awe and terror, a primal fear gripping me. This wasn't just a fish. It was a leviathan, a relic of a bygone era, a creature that had witnessed centuries of history unfold along the banks of the Mississippi. For a moment, we were locked in a silent standoff, man and monster, separated by a thin line of braided steel. He looked at me with an ancient, unknowable gaze, his eyes reflecting the sunlight like polished obsidian. Then he made a move. With a sudden surge of power, he dove beneath the boat, pulling the line taut. The boat rocked violently, and I lost my footing, stumbling forward. In that moment of disarray, something snapped. Not the line, but something in me. I realized that I was in over my head. This wasn't a game anymore. This was a battle for survival. I reached for my knife, a trusty old Bowie that had been in my family for generations. With a deep breath, I sliced through the line. The sudden release of tension was almost deafening. The boat shuddered, then slowly righted itself. I watched as Old Man Tiber disappeared back into the depths, his massive form fading into the murky shadows. I sat there for a long time, panting, shaking, my body aching from the fight. The sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the water. I felt a mixture of relief, disappointment, and profound respect. I didn't catch Old Man Tiber, but I saw him. I felt his power. I knew that the legend was real. I reeled in the severed line, retrieving the broken end. As I examined it, I noticed something odd. The steel braid wasn't just cut. It was frayed almost, melted. It was as if something had burned through it with intense heat. I looked back towards the devil's elbow, a shiver running down my spine. Maybe Old Man Tiber was more than just a giant catfish. Maybe he was something else. I didn't fish the devil's elbow again for a long time. The memory of that encounter was too vivid, too unsettling. But the legend of Old Man Tiber never left me. Years later, I heard stories of other fishermen encountering him. Some claimed he was still guarding the depths of the Mississippi, a silent sentinel of the river. Others said he had moved on, seeking new territories, new waters to dominate. I don't know the truth, but I do know this. There are things in this world that we can't explain, things that defy logic and reason. And sometimes the best thing we can do is to respect those mysteries and leave them undisturbed. As for the devil's elbow, well, it's still there, swirling and churning, a reminder of the day I came face to face with a legend. And every time I pass it, I can't help but wonder if Old Man Tiber is still lurking down there, waiting for the next unsuspecting fisherman to challenge his dominion. All right now, y'all settle in, 'cause I got another tale for you. This one's been sitting in the back of my mind for a while, just waiting for the right time to be told. The air was thick with salt and the weight of a brewing storm when I set out that morning. The kind of morning where the sky hovers between dark gray and the first signs of daybreak. And the sea, she doesn't know whether she wants to be calm or restless. And that was the thing about fishing. Every day was a gamble. Some days you'd come back with a net so full, you'd swear the ocean was handing you a gift. Other days, you'd come back empty, staring at the waves like they held a secret you weren't meant to know. But every time, you returned, drawn back by something deeper than the promise of a good haul. I had been fishing for over 45 years by then, long enough to know when the ocean was whispering warnings. That morning, she wasn't whispering. She was rumbling, restless beneath the hull of my boat as I navigated out past the jetty, beyond where the casual weekenders would dare to go. It was just me in the deep, the way it had always been. The anticipation of the unknown sent a thrill through me, the same thrill I had felt the first time I'd set sail as a young man. The wind had a bite to it, sharper than usual for that time of year, making the boat shudder with each gust. I gripped the wheel tighter as Eleanor swayed under the force, her hull groaning in protest. The biting wind wasn't just cold, it had a push to it, a presence that forced me to compensate with each turn. Every movement felt deliberate, calculated, as I fought to keep the boat steady against the invisible hands of the storm gathering on the horizon. I pulled my hat down low and adjusted my grip on the wheel. The boat, an old but reliable thing I had named Eleanor after my mother, cut through the waves with the kind of ease that comes from years of knowing how to work with the current rather than against it. The engine hummed in steady rhythm, a sound I had long since come to associate with comfort, with control. I checked my gauges, made sure my lines were secured, and pressed on. I knew my spots, the places where the fish gathered, where the water spoke of promise rather than disappointment. That day, I aimed for a stretch of sea that had been generous to me in the past. It was deeper out there, less predictable, but that was the risk you took when you made your living on the water. The best catches weren't found in safe, shallow waters. They were out here, in the deep, where you had to earn them. The silence of the open sea always settled in after a while, the kind that pressed against you, made you feel like the only soul for miles. It was a deceptive kind of peace, the sort that lulled you into stillness, made you forget that out here, nothing was ever truly at rest. That same silence would soon be shattered by the raw struggle between man and fish, a battle of will and endurance that reminded you just how alive the ocean really was. But for now, in that quiet stretch of waiting, there was only me, the gentle rise and fall of the water, and the knowledge that soon the fight would begin. I've always loved that feeling, the solitude, the freedom. A good fisherman knows how to wait. It's a patience that grows in you, like the slow pull of a tide. You learn to read the way the water shifts, the way the birds circle overhead, the way the line moves in your hands. And sometimes, when you're really listening, the ocean speaks back. And then I felt it, a tug stronger than I expected. Not the jerking fight of a smaller fish, but something steady, something that made my hands tighten around the reel. I exhaled slowly, bracing myself, and started to pull. The line went taut, vibrating with the kind of energy that tells you this isn't going to be easy. It yanked hard, and I stumbled back a step, my boots slipping slightly on the damp deck. I had hooked something big. Minutes passed, my muscles straining as I worked to bring whatever was on the other end closer. The sea around me was restless now, waves slapping against the hull of Eleanor as if trying to shake me loose. The wind had picked up, howling in my ears, but I held firm. I could feel the weight of it, the pull of something massive, something determined to fight to the bitter end. My heart pounded, adrenaline rushing through me as I adjusted my grip and leaned into the battle. Then, for the first time, I saw it. A flash of silver beneath the surface, enormous, thrashing. A tuna, and not just any tuna, a monster of a fish, bigger than any I had seen in years. My heart pounded, adrenaline surging through me. This was the kind of catch that fishermen dreamed of, the kind that could make a man's whole season in a single haul. But the fish wasn't ready to give up. It dove deep, taking my line with it. I gritted my teeth, adjusted my stance, and let it run just enough to tire itself out. I had played this game before. It was a battle of endurance now. Who would give in first? The storm was closer now. I could taste the electricity in the air, feel the way the sky had darkened. The waves were angrier, the boat rocking in protest. But I wasn't letting go. Not now. Not after fighting this hard. Another pull, another surge of strength. And then finally the fish began to give. Slowly, Inch by inch, I reeled it in, my arms burning with the effort. When it finally broke the surface, I knew I had won. Hauling it onto the boat took every last ounce of strength I had. It flopped, powerful even in its final moments, but I steadied myself and secured it. The wind howled around me, the first drops of rain stinging my face. I looked up at the sky and then back at my prize. I turned Eleanor toward home, the storm now fully upon me. The sea raged, waves crashing against the sides, but I held my course. I had faced worse, and I wasn't about to lose this fight now. By the time I reached the dock, the storm had spent itself, leaving behind only the scent of rain and the calm that comes after chaos. I sat for a moment, catching my breath, staring at the fish that had nearly bested me. Fishing isn't just about the catch. It's about the fight, the patience, the respect between man and sea. And that day, I had earned my place once again. Just me, the ocean, and a story worth telling. When I finally made it back to the cabin, Debbie was waiting for me, her arms crossed and that knowing look on her face. She didn't have to ask if it had been a good haul. She could see it in my eyes, in the exhaustion weighing down my bones. She just smiled, shook her head, and said, "Well, Jerry, I reckon you got another one for the books. Now get in here before you catch cold." I took one last look at the ocean before stepping inside, knowing full well that as long as I could hold a rod in my hands, I'd be back out there again, chasing the next big one, living the life I was born for. That night, as I sat in my chair by the fire, the warmth soaking into my bones, I thought about all the times I had been out there on the water, the fights, the struggles, the victories, and the losses. Every trip left its mark, etched into the lines of my hands and the stories in my heart. As Debbie handed me a steaming mug of coffee, I knew I wouldn't trade a single second of it for anything else in the world. The sea had given me another story, another battle, another moment where I had stood against the tide and come out the other side. And tomorrow, I'd do it all over again. And so the cycle continued, as it always had, and as long as I had strength left in my body, I would keep returning to the only life I've ever known. Hope you're ready, 'cause this next story's got a pull to it, just like a big one on the line. Let's get to it. Now I was probably, maybe 55, 56 years old at the time. Still had a good bit of salt left in my beard, but the years were starting to show. But my boat, the Sea Serpent, she was still chugging along, faithful as ever. I'd had her for over 30 years, and she knew the waters of the Gulf of Mexico better than I knew the back of my hand. It was a scorcher of a July morning, the kind that makes the air shimmer like a mirage. The sun was already beaten down hard by 6, and the humidity was thick enough you could chew on it. I remember wiping the sweat off my brow as I pulled out of the harbor in Biloxi, the Sea Serpent groaning a little as she got underway. I was after red snapper that day, a good mess of them to sell down at the market. I'd been having decent luck, but I was hoping for a real haul. Bait was fresh, tackle was ready, and I had a cooler full of ice. I was set. I headed out to my usual spot, about 20 miles offshore, where the reef dropped off sharp. The GPS coordinates were burned into my memory after all these years. I eased the anchor down, hooked up my line with some cut mullet, and waited. Regular as clockwork. The snapper started biting. I was pulling him in pretty steady for a couple of hours. Nothing huge, mind you. Mostly 2-3 pounders, but enough to make it worth my while. The sun climbed higher, the air got stickier, and the snapper started to slow down. I figured they'd gone deeper to escape the heat. That's when I decided to change things up. I figured I'd troll around a bit, maybe see if I could snag a king mackerel or two. They like to cruise around those reef edges, chasing bait fish. So I pulled up the anchor, cranked up the engine, and started to motor slowly along the edge of the reef, dragging a couple of lures behind me. Now I'd caught my share of mackerel, and even a few wahoo over the years. But I'd always dreamed of catching a marlin. They were the kings of the Gulf. Majestic creatures that could fight like hell. I'd seen pictures, heard stories, but never had one on the line. Honestly, I figured I never would. I was just about to give up on the trolling idea and head back to my original spot when it happened. The reel on my heavy-duty rod, the one I usually used for sharks, started screaming like a banshee. That wasn't no mackerel. That was something big. I grabbed the rod, and the force nearly ripped it out of my hands. Whatever was on the other end was pulling like a freight train. The sea serpent started to list to one side as the line screamed off the reel. My heart was pounding like a drum solo. "All right," I muttered to myself. "Easy does it, Jerry. Don't get too excited." I adjusted the drag, trying to find that sweet spot between letting the fish run and putting too much pressure on the line. I knew that if I clamped down too hard, it would snap. But if I let it run too much, it would spool me. The fight was on. For the first few minutes, all I could do was hold on. This thing was just taking line, heading out to open water like it owned the place. I could feel the power in every jerk and pull. It was an exhilarating, terrifying feeling. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the fish started to slow down a little. I started to gradually reel in some line, gaining a few feet with each turn of the handle. It was slow, agonizing work. My arms burned, my back ached, and sweat poured down my face. I finally managed to get a little bit of the line back, and then the fish jumped. It breached the surface of the water in a spectacular display of power, silver and black scales glinting in the sunlight. I could see its long, spear-like bill and its massive size. It was a marlin, and not just any marlin. This was a monster. "Holy Mary, Mother of God," I whispered. "That's a damn blue one." Now, I knew I was in for a fight. A marlin like that wasn't going to give up easy. I settled in for the long haul, knowing that this could take hours. As I fought the marlin, I started to think about everything I knew about them. I knew they were apex predators, built for speed and power. I knew they were solitary creatures, roaming the oceans in search of food. I knew they were a symbol of the wild, untamed beauty of the sea. I also knew that they were in trouble. Overfishing, pollution, and habitat destruction were threatening their survival. It made me think about what I was doing too. Here I am, this old man trying to catch one of these things. I started to question myself. Should I really be doing this? Was it worth the risk? To the fish? To myself? Just for the thrill of the fight? But then the marlin would surge again, pulling me back to the present moment, back to the battle. I couldn't afford to get distracted. I had to focus on what I was doing. Hour after hour, the fight went on. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The heat grew more intense, and my muscles burned with exhaustion. But I refused to give up. I was determined to see this thing through to the end, one way or another. Sometimes the marlin would run, taking out hundreds of yards of line. Other times it would sound, diving deep into the depths. And then it would jump again, a breathtaking display of raw power. Each time it jumped, it tested my resolve, pushing me to my limits. I drank water, ate a bit of a sandwich, and kept fighting. I knew I had to stay hydrated and keep my energy up if I wanted to have any chance of winning this battle. As the hours passed, I started to feel a strange connection to the marlin. I respected its strength, its tenacity, its will to survive. I also felt a sense of guilt. I was trying to kill something that was so magnificent, so powerful, so vital to the ocean ecosystem. But I pushed those thoughts aside. I couldn't afford to get sentimental. I was in the middle of a fight, and I had to focus on winning. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the marlin started to tire. His runs became shorter, his jumps less frequent. I could feel that I was gaining the upper hand. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to reel it in, inch by inch. My arms ached, my back screamed, but I kept going. I knew that if I gave up now, I would never forgive myself. As the marlin got closer, I could see it more clearly. It was even bigger than I had imagined. It was a magnificent creature with shimmering silver scales, a long pointed bill, and powerful, graceful fins. When I finally got it close enough to the boat, I reached for my gaff. But then I hesitated. I looked into the marlin's eye, and I saw something there, a kind of ancient wisdom, a quiet understanding of the natural world. In that moment, something changed in me. I realized that I couldn't kill this fish. It wasn't about the trophy, or the bragging rights, or the money. It was about respect, about honoring the life of this incredible creature. So I did something that surprised even myself. I lowered the gaff, reached for my knife, and cut the line. The marlin paused for a moment, as if surprised by my actions. Then, with a flick of its tail, it disappeared into the depths. I stood there for a long time, watching the spot where the marlin had disappeared. I felt a mixture of relief, sadness, and exhilaration. I had lost the fight, but I had won something more important. I had honored my own conscience. I reeled in the line, stowed my gear, and started the engine. As I headed back to shore, I couldn't stop smiling. I had a story to tell, a story about the one that got away, a story about respect and the wildness of the sea. Now the story doesn't quite finish there. When I got back to Biloxi, word about my encounter with the marlin had already spread like wildfire. Fishermen, dock workers, and even some tourists gathered around the sea serpent to hear my tale. They were all amazed by the size of the fish, and they were even more amazed by what I did, or rather what I didn't do. "You cut the line?" one of the fishermen asked, incredulous. "After all that fighting? You must be crazy, Jerry." I just shrugged. "Maybe I am," I said, "but I couldn't do it. It just didn't feel right." Some of them shook their heads, but others nodded in understanding. They knew what it was like to feel a connection to the sea, to respect the creatures that lived there. That night, I went down to the local bar, the Salty Dog, where all the fishermen hung out. As soon as I walked in, everyone started to cheer. "Jerry! Jerry! "Jerry," they chanted. The owner of the bar, Maggie, a tough old woman who knew her way around a fishing boat, came over and gave me a hug. "You're a legend, Jerry," she said. "You showed them all what it means to be a true fisherman." She bought me a beer, and I sat down at the bar, surrounded by my friends and colleagues. We talked about the marlin, about the fight, about the decision I made. As I sat there listening to their stories and their laughter, I realized that I had done the right thing. I had stayed true to myself, and I had earned the respect of my community. But the real reward came a few weeks later. I was out fishing again, trolling along the same reef where I had encountered the marlin. I was hoping to catch a few king mackerel, but I wasn't expecting much. Suddenly I saw something in the distance, a flash of silver, a swirl of water. It was a marlin, and it was heading straight towards my boat. As it got closer, I could see that it was the same marlin I had fought weeks before. I recognized the distinctive markings on its side, the scars from previous battles. The marlin swam right up to the sea serpent and circled the boat a few times. It looked at me with its big, wise eyes, as if to say thank you. Then with a graceful flick of its tail, it swam away, disappearing into the depths once again. I sat there for a long time, watching the spot where it had disappeared. I felt a sense of peace, a sense of gratitude. I knew that I had been blessed, that I had been given a gift. From that day on, I never looked at fishing the same way again. I still loved the challenge, the excitement, the thrill of the catch. But I also had a deeper appreciation for the beauty and the fragility of the ocean ecosystem. I started practicing catch and release more, and I took greater care to minimize my impact on the environment. And every time I went out to that reef, I always looked for that marlin. I never saw it again, but I knew that it was out there, swimming free, a symbol of the wild, untamed spirit of the sea. All right, now, enough waiting around. Let's drop our lines and see where this next story takes us. Ah, yes, there was that time, down on the Black River, back in, oh lordy, must have been around 88, maybe 89. Time flies faster than a hummingbird in heat, I'm telling you. Now the Black River, beautiful place it is, or was back then. Still pretty now, I reckon, but different. Things always change, don't they? Anyway, back then, the Black River was wilder, less touched, you could say, especially down past the old paper mill. Now that paper mill, that's important to this story. It wasn't the cleanest operation, not by a long shot. They used to dump all sorts of, well, let's just say things you wouldn't want swimming in, right into the river. Folks around here, we knew it, but back then, nobody said much. Jobs were jobs, you know. Keep your head down, keep your mouth shut, and keep fishing. And fish I did. Black River catfish were legendary. Big, meaty, tasty. Well, most of them were. I had my favorite spot, a little bend in the river, about 3 miles downstream from the mill. Deep hole there, with a big old cypress tree leaning over the water. Roots all tangled in the bank. Perfect catfish hangout. I used to go there every chance I got, early mornings mostly, when the river was still misty and quiet, just the sound of the water and the birds waking up. Peaceful, calm, just what an old fisherman needs. Now, usually, I'd catch your regular run-of-the-mill catfish there. Blues, channels, maybe a flathead if I was lucky. Good size, maybe a couple of pounds to 10, 15 on a really good day. Enough for supper, and maybe a little extra to sell down at the market. But one day was different. It was a day just like today, actually. Warm, sunny, little breeze kicking up. I got to my spot just as the sun was peeking over the trees, making the river sparkle like it was sprinkled with diamonds. Perfect fishing weather, I thought to myself. I baited up my line with some chicken liver. Catfish just can't resist that stuff, and cast it out into the deep hole under that cypress. And I waited. Now, fishing ain't just about catching fish, you know. It's about the waiting, the thinking, the watching the world go by. It's therapy, pure and simple. Just me, the river, and the quiet of nature. I was leaning back against that cypress, closing my eyes, just listening to the river gurgle by, when bam, my pole nearly jumped right out of my hands. Now, I've had big catfish hit my line before, but this was different. This wasn't no gentle tug. This was like hooking into a runaway train. My reel was screaming, line peeling off like it was on fire. I grabbed that pole tight, braced myself against the bank, and set the hook hard. Whatever was on the other end of that line, it was big, really big. The fight was on, and boy, what a fight it was. This fish pulled and tugged, dove deep, ran sideways, everything it could to get away. It was like fighting an underwater tractor. I'm telling you, my arms were aching, my back was creaking, sweat was beading up on my forehead. But I wasn't about to give up, not after a hit like that. I've been fishing too long to back down from a challenge. Now, usually, when you're fighting a big fish, you can kind of feel what it is, the way it pulls, the way it shakes its head. You get a sense of whether it's a catfish, a bass, a carp, whatever. But this was something else. It felt different, heavier, stronger, angrier somehow. And the longer I fought it, the more uneasy I started to feel. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 20 minutes, I started to gain some ground. Slowly, inch by inch, I started to crank that reel, pulling the fish up from the depths. And then I saw it. It surfaced about 50 feet out, thrashing and splashing like a wounded whale. And that's when I got my first good look at it. And let me tell you, my jaw nearly dropped to the riverbank. It was a catfish, all right, no doubt about that. But it wasn't like any catfish I'd ever seen in my life. This thing was, well, it was glowing. Not like a light bulb, mind you, but a faint, greenish, sickly sort of glow, especially around its whiskers and its fins and its eyes. Lord have mercy, its eyes were like two red coals burning in the murky water. And the size of it was huge. I mean, truly monstrous. I reckon it was at least 4 feet long, maybe 5, and as thick as a log. Its skin wasn't the usual catfish color either. It was patchy, almost like it was molting, with these strange, pale, almost translucent areas mixed in with the normal, dark brown. And it had growths, lumpy, fleshy growths all along its back and sides, looking like tumors or something. It was something straight out of a horror movie, I tell you. Wasn't the Sam Hill, I muttered to myself, reeling it in closer, but now a lot slower, a lot more cautious. I was no longer thinking about supper. Now I was just thinking about survival. This wasn't no ordinary fish. This was something else entirely. As I got it closer to the bank, I could smell it. A strange, metallic, almost chemical smell, mixed with the usual fishy river scent. And I started to put two and two together. The paper mill, the strange glow, the growths, the size. It hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a big catfish. This was a mutant, a radioactive mutant, most likely, thanks to all that stuff they were dumping in the river upstream. Now, I'm no scientist. I'm just a simple fisherman. But I knew enough to know that radiation ain't good. And this fish, well, it looked like it had been marinating in the stuff for years. My heart started thumping in my chest like a drum solo. Fear, real fear, started to creep into my bones. But you know what? Underneath the fear, there was also curiosity. Yeah, curious. I know, sounds crazy, right? Here I am, face to face with some kind of glow-in-the-dark monster fish, and I'm curious. But that's just how I am, I guess. Always been a bit of a curious soul, and maybe a little bit reckless too, or maybe just plain foolish. Take your pick. Anyway, I got it right up to the edge of the bank. It was still thrashing weakly, its red eyes glaring up at me. I could see its teeth now, long and sharp, looking like they could bite right through a steel cable. I knew I couldn't bring it in the boat. No way. That thing was too dangerous, too unnatural. So, what did I do? Well, I did the only thing I could think of. I reached for my pliers, the ones I always carry to unhook fish, and I decided I was going to cut the line. Let it go. Let it go back to whatever dark radioactive depths it came from. Some fish just ain't meant to be caught. And this was definitely one of them. But just as I was about to cut the line, something happened. The fish, it stopped thrashing. It just went still, and its red eyes, they seemed to soften somehow, almost like it was looking at me. Not in an angry way, but almost like it was asking for help. Now, I know what you're thinking. Jerry, you imagine things. It's just a fish. But I swear to you, son, that's what it felt like. It felt like this mutant catfish, this creature of the radioactive river, was looking at me with understanding, with maybe even a little bit of sadness. And in that moment, something changed in me. The fear, it faded away, replaced by, well, by pity, I guess, and maybe a little bit of guilt. Guilt that we humans, we had done this to this creature, turned it into this freak of nature. So I didn't cut the line. Instead, I did something even crazier. I gently, carefully reached down and unhooked it. Yeah, I know, sounds insane. Reaching down and unhooking a glowing mutant radioactive catfish. But I did it. Slowly, calmly, just like I was unhooking any other fish. Except this time my hands were shaking like leaves in a hurricane. And you know what? It let me. It didn't bite, didn't thrash, didn't even move. It just lay there, still as a stone, while I worked the hook free. And when I finally got it out, I just let go of the line and watched. The catfish, it just lay there for a moment, floating in the water. Then, slowly, almost deliberately, it turned its head and looked at me one more time. Those red eyes, they seemed to flicker like a dying ember. And then, with a slow, powerful flick of its tail, it vanished, sunk back down into the dark depths of the Black River. Gone. I stood there for a long time, watching the ripples fade away, just trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Had I imagined it? Had it been a hallucination, brought on by the sun and the heat? Or had I really just wrestled with, and then released, a radioactive mutant catfish? I don't know for sure, Maybe it was just the biggest catfish I ever caught, and my mind just played tricks on me, made it into something it wasn't. But I don't think so. I think deep down, I know what I saw that day, and I know why I let it go. I packed up my gear that day and walked back to my truck, a lot quieter than when I'd arrived. Didn't catch another fish that day. Didn't even want to. Just drove home and sat on this porch, just like I'm sitting now, looking out at the lake and thinking. I never went back to that spot on the Black River. Not after that. Sometimes I wonder what happened to that catfish. Is it still down there glowing in the dark, getting bigger and stranger with each passing year? Or did it not make it? Did the radiation finally catch up to it? I don't know. And maybe it's better that way. Some things are best left a mystery. But I'll tell you one thing, son. That day on the Black River, it changed me. Made me think differently about things. About the river. About the fish. About us. About what we do to this world. And what it does to us in return. So, there you have it. The tale of the radioactive mutant catfish of the Black River. A true story? Well, that's for you to decide. But I swear, every word of it is as true as I remember it. And in the end, maybe that's all that matters, eh? The memory of it, the feeling of it, the lesson of it, maybe. Well, now, I sure hope y'all enjoyed those stories as much as I enjoyed telling them. Ain't nothing better than sitting back, swapping tales, and feeling like we're all out on the water together. I'll be back tomorrow, same as always, with another one for you. Maybe something that'll have you smelling the bayou air or feeling that tug on the line, like you're right there with me. Till then, y'all rest easy, keep your spirits high, and don't forget, the best stories are the ones we carry with us. See y'all soon, and please feel free to sit back and enjoy the sounds of nature.